Reading and writing about informational texts is the second unit in the high school curriculum. If you're following the typical progression of units, you would have begun with Foundations, which includes the introduction to interpretive work, and aside from 10th grade's Joan Didion piece, this will probably be the first informational text or nonfiction that you're really digging into with your students. A quick note about the placement of this unit. The informational text unit and the dealing with difficulty unit that follows have a lot of similarities in their structure and design. Now, we place the informational text unit first because while the texts are challenging, the purpose of informational texts tends to be more straightforward than some of the literary texts that students will work with in the next unit. Students will also be introduced to a few exercises in this unit, like the search and study, that they'll get a chance to use again in dealing with difficulty. Now, in this unit, students will be working through many of the standards around both reading and writing informational texts. Here's the typical structure of this unit. Over the course of about 8 to 12 sessions, students read a set of paired texts about a common topic or theme. The texts themselves are reasonably complex in keeping with grade level expectations, so we scaffold students' work with them across a couple of sessions and multiple readings. Once students have read through the first text and spent enough time in it to analyze it together, they move into their work with the second text, which incorporates some similar comprehension work and builds toward a writing task that requires students to draw information and ideas from both of the texts. I'm going to talk about 9th grade in a bit of detail and then show the connections to other grade levels. So don't just skip to your grade level yet, because many of the things that I bring up with the first unit are going to apply to all of the others as well. 9th grade's unit is called Reading Intelligence. The first of the two texts in here is a brief profile of Steve Jobs from his biographer, Walter Isaacson. And it sets up this idea that there can be kinds of intelligence or genius that are different from the sort of stereotypical intelligence of a Bill Gates-like figure. Now, this is followed by Carol Dweck's Raising Smart Kids, a piece that introduces students to her research about fixed mindsets and growth mindsets and their effects on achievement over time. Because some of the vocabulary and the ideas will certainly be new to students, we introduce an exercise called the Search and Study. In the very first session, as you are reading the text with students for the first time, students are asked to mark anything that stands out as new, unfamiliar, or confusing, and there's time in the closing meeting of that work to collect a list of the moments that students found challenging or that they wanted more information about. We ask students to identify what it is that makes this moment challenging so they can begin thinking about possible solutions. This is some more deliberate metacognitive work. It's easy to get stumped by a text and to be stuck in that space of just thinking, I don't get it, it's too hard. But if we can move forward from that to just being able to point to some specific places that are challenging and say, I'm having trouble understanding this, and I'm having a hard time with it because of something in particular. Maybe it's an unfamiliar word, or maybe I've lost track of what the author's saying here. Well, then we've got some productive steps we can take to move forward with that. We know that these texts are challenging. The solution isn't to make the texts easier, but to acknowledge the complexity and help guide students toward productive methods of tackling this work. So, in the next session, you have a chance to brainstorm possible ways of solving these difficulties with students and to help students prioritize which things are going to be the most important to look up information about. And then they set about searching for that information related to their questions. This might be looking up vocabulary words or unfamiliar references or other similar things. They're going to need access to devices of some sort for most of this work. And they consider not only what they learn, but also how that information helps them make sense of the text. In the closing meeting, all of the students share out what they were learning so everyone can learn from one another and they reflect on their work. The search and study is a strategy that shows up from time to time in our work, including in the next unit, and it serves as a way to help students gather additional background information that they might not already have. Instead of relying on our own assumptions about what students know and don't know and trying to pre-teach everything ourselves, we can help students identify their own needs and give them space to gather that information and share it. Some texts, even complex ones, contain almost all of the information that the reader needs, but for those texts that don't, this is a handy method to use when background knowledge is a key part of the complexity. In the next session, students go back into the text with a question focused on key concepts. In this case, how Isaacson seems to use and define certain words like ingenuity or genius. And then in the fourth session of this unit, students work to determine Isaacson's central idea and analyze its development. Now, after that, work with the second text as introduced, and students go through a similar cycle of comprehension work with it. Before session 9, you might choose to introduce the informational writing rubric with an intersession that's similar to the one from the previous unit. And in session 9, students are given their final writing task. For this task, they're going to need to draw information from both texts, and you can expect this to stretch over more than one class period, as students review the texts and plan their writing and write their complete responses. As always, you can consider what next steps might make sense for your class at this time, whether you'd like them to do some editing and revision work with this piece, or whether they might file them away for use in their portfolios. At each of the other grade levels in 10th and 11th and 12th grade, you're going to find a very similar structure. The 10th grade unit is called Language and Thought, and the first of these two texts is a brief column about how people have used language to deliberately dehumanize others during wartime. The second text, by Guy Deutscher, examines more broadly the idea of whether and how language shapes our actual thought processes. For their final task, students use what they've learned to consider, why do we think the way that we do? I want to touch briefly on the texts in 11th grade, the first of which is by Malcolm Gladwell, The Order of Things, What College Rankings Really Tell Us. Now, I've seen some people take one look at that title or even the author and say, oh, that's never going to work for my students. They couldn't care less about that sort of thing. And I want to point out that if you haven't had a chance to read this text yet, college rankings are only a fraction of what Gladwell is really writing about in this essay. It's really an essay about how misleading rankings and statistics can be depending on how you weight the numbers. And the implication is that a great deal of injustice is done in the world and concealed with what looks like objective data. Similarly, the title of the essay Women's Brains by Stephen Jay Gould, that occasionally raises some eyebrows, but like Gladwell, he's writing about how people have misused data simply to confirm their own pre-existing biases. Students are going to write two responses in the 11th grade unit, one in which they're analyzing Gould's argument, and one in which they're using information from both texts to write a letter to their future self, in which they give advice about what they should be mindful of when they're considering research findings in their post-high school years. Lastly, 12th grade's Science Writing for Lay Audiences unit provides students with two different texts in which the author is presenting a complex scientific topic to a popular audience. Now, as at the other grade levels, students examine key content and ideas, but there's also a particular focus on the author's method and style in this unit. Now, just like the 11th grade unit, students are going to write more than one response, the first explaining key content in the second text, and the final task comparing the two authors' methods and style. The repeated structure across these units at the different grade levels is deliberate because comprehending informational texts isn't a matter of just learning one particular skill or technique. It involves developing a mindset and certain habits of approaching a text, and the acknowledgement that there are always going to be difficult moments in a text. What matters is that we can identify those, and we can either seek out more information or we can discuss them with our peers in order to understand them. And we should always step back to ask ourselves, what is this text really saying? And how can reading multiple sources on this topic increase our understanding of it? As you plan this unit, make sure that you take a look at the introduction, review how the search and study works, take a close look at the final writing task for your grade level, and then read through each of the texts in the student reader. Once again, they are complex, but students are given multiple class sessions to unpack them with a variety of strategies. So we encourage you to jump into the work and see what students' needs actually are, rather than trying to preempt every possible difficulty. You'll find that there is a lot of support built right into the work itself.